Okay, hi class. This is Professor Sabila. I'm out here at English Camp on San Juan National Historic Park with Chief of Interpretation, Chief of Visitor Engagement, correct?
Chief of Visitor and Youth Engagement. Yeah.
Okay.
Titles.
Brandon Cadwell. Unfortunately, we can't take you out here as part of this class, so instead, Brandon and I are going to take a walk around and talk about some of the interpretive sites we'd like to see filmed for this, or created within the Island Histories app. So with that, this is not going to be a professional production. I'm going to stop and start and film again, but it's what it is. So here we go, filming while we walk down the trail.
Excellent.
Brandon, when did this become a national park?
1966.
Okay. There was a state park before then?
Yeah, it was good. It was operated by the state of Washington. It was one of the first historic parks in the state. And then when larger need for a landscape conservation model was needed, the state kind of went and handed off to the National Park Service, and the National Park Service thought it was of national significance and enough to bring it into the system.
Very good. And we're here at English Camp.
That is correct. Though known at the time as the Royal Marine Camp. And so it's seen a couple of different names over time, the Royal Marine Camp, and then it became British Camp, and has kind of been English Camp for the last several decades.
Okay.
And we're actually on an interpretive site now that we should consider interpreting. This is the beginning of what was known as the military road that connected both English Camp and American Camp. And it changed course over time, but it was really interesting route of travel between homesteaders, soldiers alike, and I think most interestingly was built primarily by Cowichan Indians.
Oh, really?
As part of that effort.
So this trail we're on was part of that military road.
This is the military road.
Well, there's our first interpretive site, students, the military road. Hopefully one of you will write a story about that, create a digital exhibit. This is such a beautiful part of the world. Hopefully, what are we going to do next summer, Brandon?
Do a public history field school.
A public history field school out here at English Camp and American Camp and around the island. It's unusual, this flat area. What's going on with this big flat area here?
It's the cover of a giant well. It's unfortunately nothing more.
I didn't mean that. I meant the whole plain.
Oh, the whole plain. Got it. Yes. Highly unusual for the area. And it's known as a shell midden. And if you're like me and are unfamiliar with that term, is that over thousands and thousands of years of occupation between primarily Coast Salish ancestors that were here, but also brought about by shorebirds, what they would do is they would take all of the shellfish and the oysters, and they would basically turn into one giant, almost like a trash pile. And then when the British soldiers got here, they kind of basically crunched it all down and formed it into, usable land. And as we kind of continue on, you'll see in this back end where things are more green is kind of where the actual soil of the island is. As we get closer to the water, it does not take long for it to die out into some yellow and brown grasses that is almost entirely shell midden, and you'll see it's a huge tract of land.
Good.
Julie Steinson did some great writing on it. So it's an archaeological resource.
So, and what was the name of the author who wrote on it?
Dr. Julie Stein.
Okay, very good. All right. Which way should we go?
Let's go left.
One of the very last days of August as we're doing this. One of the glories of the San Juans is that we're in a rain shadow here caused by the Olympic Mountains. So it's drier and sunnier than many places on the west side of the state.
So to our right is another story, is the barracks building. This was inhabited by British Royal Marine Light Infantry, and so the building saw a couple different phases. First as a kitchen and mess, and then a barracks that kind of took over both areas of that. And inside you can see historic material that reflects a little bit of those change in uses. So there are also like wonderful photographs that exist in the world, not specifically of here, but as militaries tend to do, they standardize their materials and practices in given periods of time, and so you can see these wrought iron beds in their uniform makeup, sitting at the edge of the bed. It's very, very neat, and so yeah, this is home on halfway across the world for a bunch of soldiers that just got here from China.
Okay.
And the third largest maple tree in the world.
Third largest maple tree in the world.
It used to be the largest until lightning struck it and took out a section once upon a time. And so now some punk tree in Oregon took our title.
That fucking tree. Oops, shouldn't use that language.
Oh.
Nice class.
Out.
Okay.
Take it out in post.
I do need to learn how to edit video.
What a great time.
Well, this is unexpected.
Yeah, so as we come out here, we've come across what is known as the English formal gardens. So the garden saw a couple different phases, and I think there's really two stories, or one really big story, or two more specific, and that's about the changing of the garden. So for the Americans, the largest real city, Bellingham was starting to develop, but lots of cultural opportunities and a large population. The nearest one was really San Francisco. Seattle's starting to form in 1853, but not a lot's going on. But the British had Victoria, which was just a half a day steam ride away, and so they had lots of goods. And so after quickly establishing this, they were able to transition from a needed vegetable garden to the feeling and comforts of home for the officers. So this formal garden was established based off some of the formal gardens back in Great Britain.
Because what could be more English than an English garden?
And that's exactly it.
Neat.
And so we've recreated this at the establishment of the park in the early 70s, because when the Crook family filed a homestead claim on this area afterwards, this whole area was an orchard up and down the Shell-Midden, and so as it was reclaimed into a park, the formal garden has been reestablished.
Okay. Very good. Where should we go next?
You want to go up?
Let's go up and maybe catch that marker
Okay.
up there, because I think that's the story. It's a pretty fabulous view here.
It's not bad.
And we're up on this kind of flat area. What's going on up here?
So in this flat area, with most Western militaries, officers are separated from enlisted men, and that's what's happening here. We are on the officers' hill, and after coming up these stairs and being a little winded, most of the officers' quarters were up on this tall hill that we're going to be heading to next. But down here, in this flat area, would have also included the hospital steward. He was set aside from the enlisted men and was near the officers up here as well. But this is, as we look around, you really have to begin to use your imagination, knowing that most of these trees weren't here. And so they had these open, sweeping views. So unless it's a really big guy like these here, most of these trees weren't around 160 years ago.
That'd be a good interpretive point to make for whoever does the exhibit for this.
Yep.
So, officers' row here.
Officers' row.
Okay.
assistant surgeon, not the hospital steward. All right. So unlike American camp, the commanding officers at the Royal Marine Camp, British Camp, English Camp were much longer tenured, and one of those was William Delacombe, and he was the second commander here at English Camp, and he had a role in being able to design his own house that was about a little bit, almost 200 feet higher than the grounds below, and it had 5 rooms, and I had a live-in servant and raised a family here on the other side of the world for the better part of, I think, 6 years. I'll need to double check that number, but this is where the home was, and was able to look down upon the operating military camp that he was in charge of, and here on Garrison Bay. But it unfortunately burned down in a fire in later years in the post-military period. And many of the other buildings around here, as kind of was standard practice, were often disassembled and repurposed for other needs in town.
Because milled lumber was valuable.
Absolutely. And so here we have one of 2 monuments in the park. It was put up in 1904 by the Washington University State Historical Society. And there's one here and one matching in American camp, and each one of them kind of commemorating the existence of the camp, kind of alluding to the importance of a peaceful arbitration and not having to go to war. And so it just kind of marks the location of each major camp. And so in 1904, hundreds of people are gathered around for the dedication of this monument as it has stood over time. So it mentions when it was erected, the fact that it was settled by arbitration and the first commanding officer. And so it stands here where the commanding officer's quarters were here in English Camp.
We'll look at the other one later. I've seen great historic photographs of the dedication of this with all of those people, but also in those old photographs, if you look closely, often you can see the vegetation in the background and see a story of environmental change as well. Okay, we're back down on the prairie now. Again, standing on, we talked about the shell midden, and you can see especially where all the grass is dead because the water drains right through the shells below us. And this is how many acres of the shell midden? Do you recall off the top of your head?
Not with any.
Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty enormous area to be made all of people's dinner remains.
I mean, between more than 5 acres.
Yeah.
That's pretty easy guess. I mean, you can look how far back it goes. You can see where the grass starts getting green again back there. That's where kind of native lands ended, and everything coming forth all the way to the water's edge.
It's a whole lot of clams. Here.
Thousands of years.
Well, what's this funky looking building here?
We have 2 things of note here. The first one is known as a blockhouse. And so it was originally built to be a defense system against raiding Indians, but of course that was never an issue here. And it was actually one of the few designs that the British took from the Americans, that this was based off of American blockhouses here in the Northwest. But so what it ended up being used for was as a holding cell for drunken, disorderly soldiers over time. They'd be thrown in to be locked up and sober up by the next day. And that's kind of its existing legacy.
A traditional thing you need with soldiers.
Absolutely.
A place for them to sober up.
And then behind us is kind of a more modern, interesting story, is that this giant flagpole was a gift from the country of Great Britain back in 1997. And so there was this giant event with diplomats and the consulates all involved between the countries. Royal Marines came back to the country for the first time in, I think, 50 years for the dedication of this flagpole for the ongoing continued friendship between the United States and the United Kingdom.
Huh.
So I guess 1998, I apologize.
That might be a fun story as well for a student to tell.
I think so.
Very good. In this bay we're looking at, what bay is this?
This is Garrison Bay.
And this is why we're here, right?
Yes, this is why we're here. So when the joint occupation was decided upon, that was decided in October of 1859, but the Royal Marines don't get here until the March of 1816, so they had a time to choose where they wanted to be on the island after the Americans already entrenched themselves down where they're currently an American camp. And so coming in here, this was one of the few places that would be kind of sheltered enough from harsh winter storms, but that they could also build out a pier that you can get some decent sized ships in here. Anything with a really deep hull, this was going to be too much and they'd have to stop at Roche Harbor, but this was decent enough for most uses, being able to come in here.
The Americans came to fight and set up to fight. By the time the British got here, they're pretty sure there wasn't going to be any fighting.
Yeah, they understood it was a run out the clock kind of operation.
Yep, absolutely.
And so they got cozy.
Okay. Let's walk down here and see what else there is to see.
Absolutely. And actually, if you look, you can still see some shell material. The shell midden is still growing. There's still shell midden material everywhere you look. And so this is
in this case left by birds.
Yes, left by birds, and they were some of the most prolific leavers of material. And so it's still, this is an archaeological resource. This is a story of people beneath our feet, and it's still active. It is, it's thousands of years old, and that history has not stopped.
Somebody wants to write about shell middens. There's a really moving chapter in an old book called The Curve of Time from this woman who sails around in the Gulf Islands, which are sometimes called the Canadian San Juans, in the 20s and 30s. And she has a chapter about how you could always find an Indian village by seeing the bleached shell middens. Even then, for the most part, by now, the shell middens are covered over with some organic debris like this. What have we got here?
So what we have here was a gift. So in 2016, the National Park Service celebrated 100 years as an agency and stewardship and looking forward to the future. And as part of that, there were big commemorative events around the country. And this was a gift to the park. And we've got two salmon boards here and a storyboard in the center. This is not a traditional totem. These are storyboards.
Not a totem.
Not a totem. And mostly carved by Lummi artists and I think Songhees, but I'll need to double check that. And this is, for the Lummi people, this is Garrison Bay right in front of us is their place of emergence as a people onto this plane of existence. And so these storyboards kind of talk about the relationship of the people and the salmon and the world around them. And so this was a gift to the park, and we find that it's incredibly important because every place you have a national park, every story there is a native story. We don't have national parks without the displacement of native peoples. It is the story of every national park, and it is an uncomfortable truth. And so we currently are working with our tribal partners to reestablish their usual and accustomed areas to make sure that they're taking part in cultural and agricultural and spiritual practices on their ancestral homelands as much as we can, as we try to rebuild the relationship as much as that is possible after every broken promise on the planet. So this was, even though the park is set aside for the pig war and the boundary dispute, this landscape is a native landscape. And so history is not so cleanly separated, and so make sure that we're taking those twines and making sure that they're stronger together and giving the full context of a given site.
And this is a Park Service wide kind of initiative, isn't it, in so many places, to try and tell the native story and not begin with the first white person.
It's slow. Stories are hard to change because as they've become entrenched and then visited by the parents and grandparents or children and grandchildren of first white settlers, that's the story that becomes ingrained, and that's the one that becomes important. And so it takes it takes champions and people that care enough to make that change.
I love this sign right here, just mostly for the details. I see a terrible sign there. For the details, for the imaginative recreation of what was here. And I wonder if there shouldn't be a story right here, not about the sign itself, but about asking the visitor to look at this picture and think about what was out here in front of them. It's a nice place to use your historical imagination. What's this over here?
This was the first building ever built This is the commissary, or more commonly known as the storehouse.
Mhm.
So out the front doors of this building would have been a pier going out to the water, and so all of your major goods being offloaded come straight here, rolling right inside the building, because this is what keeps the camp going. This is where food first comes. This is where building materials come to support the building and maintenance and operation of a military post on the other side of the world. And so this was the first and considered the most important building to get up and going. So everyone's living in tents while this building is going up.
Now, if it weren't for COVID times, this building over here, which was the mess,
originally a mess hall, and then eventually, and for the longer duration period of time, the barracks.
Okay, that would have been open. Would this be open ordinarily?
Yes, for the first time 2 years ago, in its 50-year history, it's finally been open to the public and starting to host special exhibits. Whether we've hosted a contemporary art exhibit in here based around art in the San Juans, and so hopefully we'll start being able to interpret this a little better, maybe bring in historic furnishings, and then running an escape room out of it as special interpretive programming in October, something like that. But it's now finally open to the public.
Okay, and over here at the edge of the park. Well, so we're not at the edge of the park, are we?
Well, it's the water.
Okay, at the edge of the water, we see some apple trees. The apple tree has a fascinating history. They are not native to North America. They are weird trees. If you plant an apple seed from an apple that you're eating, you will not get a tree that produces apples like that. You'll get a random genetic variant of an apple tree that will almost certainly produce something you wouldn't want to eat. They have to be grafted from roots. And white pioneers, white settlers, I should say, brought them everywhere across the American West with them. Apples were a source of sweetness in an age when commercial sugar was, largely unavailable and expensive because it came from such distance. Honey you had to pretty much fight the bees for, but apples are a source of sweetness. And apples are also a source of alcohol, because if you can ferment it, people fermented it. And so apple cider was more popular than beer in much of the 19th century, and particularly in frontier areas, because it was easier to make. And are these trees original to English Camp, do you think?
Yeah, these trees were original to the military period and were then used as part of the Crook homestead afterwards. But yeah, these are original to the military period.
So these were planted by the Royal Marines?
Royal Marine planted.
Do we know what variety of apple there are? You're not having a very good apple here, are you?
No, it's not very well taken care of.
Uh-huh. Well, come on, man.
Let me grab my shears.
All right.
So what does a soldier do on a daily basis? A lot of it's based around monotony and routine, but eventually soldiers had the opportunity to relax and engage in recreation, and so a lot of that happens back here. And it certainly happens on holidays like the Queen's birthday, Christmas. Dances are held, musicians came in and plays were produced, they did recreational games out here on the field. They did log rolling competitions in the water, and so there's a lot to do at periods of relaxation and recreation for soldiers in places like this, as to keep themselves busy and entertained so far from home.
And that's an important part of the story too, to look at, not just they're soldiers, but they don't do any fighting in the period of time when they're out here. So what do they do? I think that's an interesting story to tell. Now we're walking back into the woods directly from English Camp, because the camp didn't end at the tree line. There are quite a few buildings up here.
A number, and trees and vegetation have absolutely taken over all of it. And it's one of those things to remember as an important factor, is that landscapes change if not maintained. And so we have some pretty big trees coming what would be right through any major room of a building, as multiple barracks buildings are up here, blacksmith shops buildings are up here, and time has just reclaimed it.
There's a lot of loose talk about wilderness sometimes, but There's really no such thing as wilderness. The North American landscape has been shaped by human occupation for at least 10,000 years. It was shaped by native peoples, and then it's been shaped by whites since, and shaped by whites in different ways from one generation to the next.
If you look at photographs of this area, there are buildings lining this entire section in front of me, which are not just filled with brush anymore, but you've got good-sized trees here as well. And one of the archaeological remnants is this of a blacksmith shop. And the blacksmith is easily one of the busiest people in a military camp. They were actually paid extra to have that duty as a soldier. And so this is the only remnant that we have left of that. But when you're establishing a camp and the daily maintenance of the wear and tear, you didn't order a new part, you made it. And this is where it was done.
We can't emphasize enough that for the Royal Marines, they're at the very far end of the world, from where they grew up, from everything they knew, and from their supply chains. And what's this building over here? This has been interpreted already, but...
Yeah, this is the Crook House. So after the military occupation ends and the British abandon this, and the American military does as well, a gentleman by the name of James Crook files a homestead claim on this parcel, and so it takes him quite some time. This building doesn't get built until 1903. So originally he is adapting and living out of the old military buildings, such as the barracks, and there's some really great photographs of like little lean-tos and stuff that they built on top of that, or as part of that, and they kind of homesteaded out of those and started planting orchard trees and grazing down there. There's a document called An Environmental History of the park that is rich in detail and stories and photographs about all of this. And so eventually, as enough time passes, he's able to build, considered a formal home for himself and his family that sits on the old hill where former barracks buildings were, looking down on the camp.
For Crook, it's a pretty sweet homestead. There's all this milled timber here already. There's some apple trees planted already. The brush is cleared out.
He knew what other people didn't, and he set himself up for building generational wealth for he and his family.
I understand there's a moonshine still up here.
Don't tell anyone.
Okay, I better stop filming.
Alright, I'm told, so this is my first time up here, that there are homestead remains of like foundations and stuff. So we should take a quick look for that.
I can hear a deer crashing through the forest over here, right into the road. Be careful. Good, he stopped for the car.
But this is the Sandwith Orchard. Sandwith was one of the early homestead families on the west side of the island, and this has been the park's effort to maintain and restore and really rejuvenate the orchard a little bit. But I think there's a great family on the Sandwiths. I've got a file for them somewhere.
The apple industry was a big deal in the San Juans at one point. It's excellent growing here for apples. It was easy to put them onto ships when that was one of the main ways of moving things around. And they went elsewhere. There's also a history of the Park Service and state parks trying to maintain historic apple orchards. My wife and I were married in a historic apple orchard in Stehekin in North Cascades National Park. Where do we think the homestead remains are?
I don't know. We'll have to do some looking and investigating.
Okay, we'll be right back, guys. That doesn't look quite ready.
Not yet. Ooh, but these pears.
Pears. Another thing worth mentioning is historic apple varietals. If you go to the grocery store now, you see 6 or 10 kinds of apples. There were hundreds of kinds of apples in the 19th century, many of which they're documented in advertising and stories, but they don't always exist anymore. So there are historians / botanists who go around the American West or around the country finding old abandoned apple orchards, because an apple tree can live for hundreds of years. One that was planted by the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver in the 1830s just recently died, like last week. So these people go out through the American West. Maybe I'll sign a reading about it, looking for historic apple trees. They ought to come here. Okay, kids, we're not quite sure what this one is. It's huge. It seems to be an apple tree, but it's way too big for an apple tree.
Plum tree?
Found exactly one fruit on it.
I got some fruit over here.
Okay.
Yeah,
Field work, people. This is what it looks like.
delicious field work.
Oh, looks like pears.
Pears.
Okay, it's a great big pear tree.
Tallest pear tree.
I think this is what Lost looks like.
Yeah.
So here's a big flat area. It's pretty promising for a, I think, for an old homestead. It's also
find no home.
yeah. It looks like a bit of a brush bash to get through there. So maybe I'll assign one of you to do it during the field school. Yeah. Oh, maybe I'm standing right on top of it. It's hard to say. One has to dress for this kind of work. Well, where are we walking now, Brandon?
We are in the group campsite within English Camp here at the park. This is a campground that the park built about 2 years ago to serve educational purposes. So its primary focus is that it's not open to the public at all, but it's open to schools, youth organizations. And youth is up to 35 years old, so it's really a pretty wide range.
I'm still excluded. I'm not impressed.
We'll see what we can do. To come out here and use the park as a place to recreate, as a place to learn, as a place to explore. And so as you look around, you'll see a number of platforms out here. And so when we're up and swinging in the summer, we actually have these large glamping style canvas tents that we set up for the people that stay here with cots inside. And so we've got a little village of about 10 canvas tents that each fit 4 people, and so it's perfect for people to be able to bring classes out here, use the island as a base to explore, and then right here have a fire at the end of the evening. And as you look up the hill, we have this covered picnic pavilion that also has a commercial kitchen attached. So by bringing a few of your own supplies, you can really kind of hunker down here. You've got electricity to charge laptops and phones, and really make this an environment to launch from.
So let's address this to my fellow professors at Eastern Washington University. If they want to take students out to the San Juan Islands and use this as a base for educational opportunity, how would they go about that?
You just contact me. You email me, you call me on my cell phone, and we're going to make it happen. Because I personally believe that parks are great places to put learning into practice, to come use our intertidal lagoons to conduct science experiments and do citizen science and monitoring, or to come here and study history, or bring out multimedia students with history students to create short little documentaries and do some interdisciplinary learning to study the geology of the islands. That there's no better place to do that, and we want to make that as accommodating as possible for you to be able to do that and come out here and use the islands as your personal laboratory through the park.
Very good. And I've taken students out here twice and camped out here. Geology students from Eastern Washington University have been out here. What's the cost of bringing your students here?
The cost of you getting here. This is an entirely free campground that we offer to you. We just want you to come use the park as a learning lab.
Tents, cots, and everything.
Tents, cots, and everything. We put them up, we take them down, make sure it's clean for you.
Very good. So this is just an incredible opportunity. I want to urge some of my colleagues at Eastern. I can't stress what a beautiful sylvan spot this is in the afternoon, the sun filtering through the pine trees. The canvas wall tents up. It's like out of a Wes Anderson film, Moonrise Kingdom, I suppose. And if you go past this commercial kitchen area and down the trail in about a quarter mile or so, and maybe less than that, you're at English Camp in a beautiful Griffin Bay. You can also go along the road, or I think there's actually a trail out to Roach Harbor, about 2 miles, and there are showers there and a grocery store and a little restaurant, things like that. So it's just a superb learning environment here.